Musical Fidelity has spent more than 4 decades making some of the best solid-state Class AB designs in hi-fi, and the M6xi ranks among the best-sounding amplifiers we've tested. Considering some of the amplifiers that have come through this room, including Musical Fidelity's own M8xi and new Vista 600.2, that's not a statement I make lightly. The M6xi is Musical Fidelity's answer to the modern all-in-one amplifier trend, just without what some may consider an unnecessary screen or app-centric user experience. Instead, you get what looks like an old-school amplifier with physical input buttons and a large center-mounted volume control right on the front, plus a feast of robust analog and digital connections around back, including HDMI eARC along with a built-in DAC. Modern conveniences are great, but they're only part of the reason the M6xi ranks among the best amplifiers we've heard this year. What matters more is performance. I put the amp to work with our reference Wilson Audio Sabrina Vs. The Sabrinas are a 4 ohm load that dips to just over 2 ohms in the bass, making them a challenge for most amplifiers. But with 220 watts per channel into 8 ohms and 320 watts into 4, the M6xi drove the Wilsons comfortably with effortless control and no audible signs of strain. In terms of sheer output and control, the M6xi was virtually indistinguishable from the $20,000 D'Agostino Pendulum driving the same speakers. That does not mean the two amplifiers sounded identical, but the differences had a lot less to do with power than you might expect. The bigger difference was tone, and this is where I actually preferred the M6xi to, well, just about anything. The Musical Fidelity is a neutral sounding amplifier, and like the Pendulum, it doesn't noticeably color or change what you're listening to, yet it gives instruments and voices a greater sense of weight, solidity, and just physical presence that, to me, made music and even dialogue sound more lifelike. Whether it was Beyoncé and Miley Cyrus on Two Most Wanted or dialogue from Daisy Jones and the Six, voices had a physical presence that made them feel lifelike. And that same quality extended to instruments. John Battiste's Yamaha piano on Beethoven Blues rivaled what I heard when the Pendulum was connected. And it also came surprisingly close to matching the weight and control of my Beolab 50s. Now, it might seem odd to make the comparison with the 50s, which are powered, DSP-tuned loudspeakers, but the Musical Fidelity Sabrina combo didn't give up much ground. That extra weight doesn't negatively impact the amp's speed or control. The M6xi kept a very tight grip on the Wilson's 8-inch woofer and 7-inch mid-range. Splitting hairs, the Pendulum could tease out just a little bit more low-end detail and start and stop precision when I listened specifically for differences, but the gap was small. In a true double-blind comparison, I would not be surprised if telling which amplifier was driving the Sabrina Vs came down to a coin toss. The clearest difference between the two was in the treble. The M6xi didn't push the Wilson tweeter quite as hard at the extreme top end, sounding ever so slightly more subdued at the limits of its extension, which I preferred. As I pointed out in my Pendulum review, there are moments during Moby's Ever-Loving, particularly around that 2-minute mark, where the highs, they can just start to glare. Through the Pendulum, they could sit right on the edge of fatigue, at the same volume in the same room through the same speakers. That simply was not my experience with the M6xi. The top end was still nimble and airy, but it traded a little of the Pendulum's ultimate extension and bite for a smoother, more forgiving presentation. Some emphasis on some of the attack from a hard cymbal crash or upper register piano note could sound slightly subdued, but the benefit of this was greater long-term listening comfort. Day to day, across the widest range of music and recording qualities, I prefer the M6xi. Dynamically, that slightly more restrained top end could make the M6i sound a little less explosive than the Pendulum or a really solid Class D amplifier like my DVLA Astra. But again, we are talking about differences that only become obvious in a direct side-by-side comparison. Without either of those $20,000 amplifiers sitting right next to it, I seriously doubt anyone would hear this amp and think it sounded anything less than dynamic. Where this amp excels is in the soundstage. Separation was excellent, with instruments and performers precisely placed between the speakers and extending well beyond them when the recording allowed it. In fact, this is one of the reasons I rank the M6xi among the best sounding amplifiers we've had in-house this year. Across a wide range of loudspeakers, it just consistently produced some of the most realistic and dimensional sound stages I've heard. That same ability to separate the layers of a recording carried over to the M6xi's built-in moving magnet, moving coil Phono stage. In fact, I preferred it to every other integrated amplifier we've tested this year, with the exception of the gotta pay extra for it Phono stage in the Pendulum, where I would call the comparison a draw. The M6xi's internal DAC was equally easy to live with. Now, comparing it directly with the Eversolo Z10 and the new A8 Mark II Master Edition, I occasionally heard more subtle differences in detail or a touch more decay through the external DACs. But we are splitting hairs. In most systems, those differences, they're likely to be overshadowed by your room, your speakers, or just the totality of your setup. Unless you are someone who listens specifically for differences or who obsess over measurements, I wouldn't feel any urgency to add an external DAC. HDMI was, surprise, flawless across several different TVs, including the latest from Hisense, TCL, and Sony. It always worked. CEC was equally reliable, letting me control volume with either the TV or Apple TV remote. And this was a godsend because while Musical Fidelity has redesigned their remote, and it is an improvement, I still don't particularly care for it. Truthfully, there's not much missing from the M6xi using it day to day. No, it doesn't have built-in streaming or a dedicated subwoofer output with bass management, but neither is difficult to add. A simple streamer from Wim or Eversolo takes care of streaming, and because the M6xi's internal DAC is already very capable, you don't necessarily need to spend additional money on a separate DAC. There's also a relatively straightforward workaround when it comes to subwoofer integration. You can use the variable preamp outputs to connect one or two subs, then handle crossover level and phase at the subwoofer itself, which some listeners might actually prefer. And if you want to fold the amp into, say, a home theater, its home theater bypass lets your processor or receiver take over volume and bass management, while Musical Fidelity handles the amplification for your left and right speakers. Given its capable DAC, flawless HDMI performance, and a Phono stage that comes remarkably close to the best I've heard, the M6xi at under $4,000 may be the clearest example of diminishing returns I've encountered when it comes to spending more. Stepping up to the excellent Sim Audio Moon 371 gets you built-in streaming and a class-leading color display, but not much else. Its sonic character is more relaxed, whereas the Musical Fidelity has greater spatial separation, greater control, and that more neutral sound. Much further upmarket, the M6xi comes very close to D'Agostino Pendulum. Yes, the Pendulum sounds different, but those differences are more subtle than transformative, and whether everyone constitutes an improvement is going to come down to personal taste. The M6xi was easier to live with than the fully optioned out Pendulum, which, at least to me, matters. Inside Musical Fidelity's own product line, both the 6-year-old M8xi and newer New Vista 600.2 have earned places on my personal leaderboard of all-time greats. The M8xi is it's one of those amplifiers I am still kicking myself for not keeping. It's just as good as the $20,000 Pendulum and a bargain by comparison, but for someone who doesn't want to spend $8,000, the M6xi is a heck of an alternative, especially when you consider the modern conveniences it brings to the table. Now, the all-analog new Vista at $9,000 is for the person, who wants a hint of that dimension that tubes bring to the upper mid-range and high frequencies without sacrificing the grip the brand is known for in the bass. The outlier is the Class D Naim CI Uniti 102. Deciding between these two is a real struggle for me, especially knowing that I'm going to save about $2,000 going with the Naim. The Musical Fidelity has a more organic, traditional hi-fi character and sounds weightier in direct A/B comparisons. But the 102 is no slouch. It's just as capable of driving demanding speakers like our Wilsons. The Naim wins me over because it lets me indulge my inner nerd and adjust my speaker's in-room response with DSP and EQ, which I get won't be everyone's cup of tea. Now, I also like that I can hide it from view, which appeals to the minimalist in me. Does that make the M6xi any less worthwhile? Not at all. In an overly connected world, it offers an incredible balance of modern convenience and reference-grade performance. That makes the M6xi not only a giant in its own right, but a legitimate giant killer. If you missed our Naim review, watch it here next.